Hey guys, it's the Scholar General Ming. Today I'm going to talk about this giant two-handed sword. It's the LK Chen Chang Dao. Now my good friend Jeremy Thomas from the Rogers Park May Athletic Association was super kind and he let me borrow this sword for a couple weeks to make this video. I'm super grateful for that opportunity, and also make sure that you go check out his channel because he has a couple videos about this sword and he'll make more in the future. So let's get down to business. This is a giant sword and there's a lot to talk about with this sword. So first, in this video, I'm going to talk about the history of the design of this weapon, and then I'm also going to talk about the martial techniques that were used with this weapon. And one big question when it comes to this type of Ming Dynasty Changdao is, what role does Japan play in the influence of both the design and the martial use of this weapon? I believe that this type of sword design quite clearly originates from Japan and was brought to China, and there's a few reasons for that. Number one, we have swords like this that start to appear in Japan around the 13th and 14th centuries. They become quite popular, and we have a dearth of evidence of early Ming swords like this. This is really a question of proportion. If you look at this sword, the blade is much longer than the handle, right? And in the Ming Dynasty, most Dao that were used with two hands would have a handle that's equal or greater in length than the blade. So it's more like a glaive, like a Dao, like the Song Dynasty Dao back there, where you can have it's like 1-to-1 ratio of hilt to blade. But this type of design where the blade is at least 2 or 3 times bigger than the handle is something that only starts to appear in the late Ming. And my last reason why I think that this is primarily from Japan is because we have a lot of textual evidence of various authors all saying that this comes from Japan. We know that there was an expanding importation of Japanese blades into the Ming Dynasty, over the course of the dynasty, but most of these blades would not be giant two-handers like this, right? However, in the 9th year of the Wuzong Emperor, which is 1514, we do have a textual account which says that the Imperial Bodyguard Force received 2,000 long-handled Japanese Dao. So there are a number of antiques floating around in China of swords of these size and proportion, and many researchers, date them back to this 1514 year, whenever these long-handled Japanese blades were brought in. Now, I think it's very difficult to say exactly if an antique is from that time period. However, I do think it's quite clear that they are 16th century blades and they have proportions similar to this one. And LK Chen modeled this particular sword off of those antiques. That is why this sword is called the Cheng Chang Dao, or the Imperial Bodyguard Long Dao. The blade on this sword is about 107 centimeters, which is like 3.5 feet, give or take. And then it has a handle which is, almost 2 feet or around 50 centimeters. In size and length, this is actually quite similar to many two-handed swords from other cultures, such as Europe. You have the big Zweihander or Montante, these types of things. And most of these are very similar in length and size. They will just have a slightly shorter handle. But there are actually quite a few other textual sources that talk about the details of this sword, and particularly their size, because they're known for being very large. However, I do think first we have to talk a little bit about rulers. One of the most common used in measurement during the Ming Dynasty was what's called a chi, which is sometimes translated to like a foot in English. I prefer to call it a ruler for various reasons. Number one, because it's usually not exactly 12 inches. But what's important to understand is that in pre-modern societies, units of measurement were not nearly as standardized as they are now. Now, if you go and you buy, something that has a meter measuring stick, it's going to be a meter long, right? In the past, it was not like that. And it made things even more complicated. Different professions used different size rulers, and there's also regional variation, and of course it changes over time and all this other stuff. During the Ming Dynasty, one of the most common chi was what's called the Zhou chi, which is it's supposed to be an older style ruler that goes back to the Zhou Dynasty. Whether or not it does is another question, but in general, it's supposed to be about 22 centimeters or 8.5 inches. And then there's another chi, which is the Yingzao chi. And this one is the carpenter's ruler, because it's made for constructing buildings and houses. This one is supposed to be about 32 centimeters, give or take, so about 12.5 inches. However, it's also possible that there could have been something kind of like an armorer's ruler. Peter Decker's done some work on this later in the Qing dynasty, where he compares the size of antiques to measurements taken in imperial regulation documents in the Huangchao Li Qi Chu Shi. And according to him, an armorer's ruler might be somewhere around 35 centimeters or so. Needless to say, all this is extremely complicated, and rulers are not standardized, and individuals, you can try to make it exactly the same as someone else's, but without being extremely precise, things will just get out of whack over time. So with the complications involved with chi and rulers in mind, let's take a look at some of these texts and see what they say about the design of this type of sword. The first major text that provides descriptions of this blade was written by General Jiguang. Now, longtime viewers of my channel will of course be familiar with this person, but a famous Ming Dynasty general who wrote many texts on how to take peasants and turn them into soldiers. And in his early career, part of his job was to fight against what's called the wokou, or Japanese bandits or pirates. It should be noted that most of these pirates were not Japanese, but there were many Japanese weapons being used by the wokou. So General Jiguang reportedly had contact with large two-handed swords like this, and later on in his career, whenever he revised the Jixiao Xinshu and he republished it in 1584, he had a manual about it, and he included measurements for the sword. In this text, Jiguang writes that the blade of the Changdao is Wushu, or 5 rulers. Now, if we took the carpenter's ruler, or the Yingzao Chi, as the measurement here, that would mean that his sword has a 160 centimeter blade and is over 2 meters in total length. And that would actually make the blade of his sword basically as long as this entire sword here that I am holding. And then you'd have to have a handle added on. I personally find that a little bit hard to believe, because I think it'd be extremely unmanageable, and many of the other antiques and stuff we have are this size. And if we actually take his measurements and we use the Zhou Dynasty Chi, or the Zhou Chi, as a standard, which remember is like 8.5 inches, so it's about 2/3 the size of the carpenter's ruler, then we would get measurements which are much closer to this one. And the blade on that one would be about 110 centimeters, so that would just be a couple centimeters longer than this blade. In addition to that, General Jiguang also records that on his Changdao, he has a tunko, or a blade collar, which is made of copper, that extends from the base of the hilt all the way up to 1 chi in length. So it could be anywhere between like 8 to 12 inches. And you actually are supposed to grab onto this when you're swinging it around. So that makes it where you can manage the leverage a little better. Interestingly, this is also a feature which is found on some Japanese odachi, or the large two-handed blades. Eventually, in time in Japan, they would wrap the base of the blade. This actually evolved into the nagamaki, which is the famous kind of pseudo sword polearm that has a long handle and a long blade. I should say that in Jiguang's manual for this weapon, the images that he provides kind of just show someone, it looks like they're swinging a stick around, but in a later Korean reprint of this manual, they do indeed show this long blade collar, and they show that you're supposed to be holding it when you're executing these techniques. So another text that gives a lot of information about the size of these weapons and how they're used is the Dandao Faxuan, written by Zongyou. Zongyou actually gives measurements for 2 different types of blade like this. One of them is much bigger and one of them is much smaller. Now, the larger one, he describes as being a total length of Wushu, or 5 rulers, and then it has a blade that's a little over 3 rulers. And if you use the carpenter's ruler, when you map out these measurements, you get dimensions that are very similar to the one here. Basically, he would have a slightly shorter handle and a slightly longer blade, but overall, the total length is almost identical to this sword. And that's one reason why I suspect that Zongyou might be using the carpenter's ruler instead of the Zhou Dynasty ruler, because the measurements of his blade would line up to this one, which is based off antiques, very closely. The other set of measurements given by Zongyou, which describe a different size two-handed sword, are quite a bit smaller than this one. It's about 40 centimeters shorter, so like 1.5 feet or so shorter. That one is intended to be used whenever the soldier is carrying a crossbow. So now let's talk about the details of this reproduction designed by LK Chen. Now this blade is similar to many Japanese swords in that it has this ridge going along the flat of the blade, which is called the shinogi. And this is something which is explicitly mentioned in Cheng Zongyou's text, that this blade should have this ridge going on the flat. One feature that makes this blade quite a bit different to many Japanese swords is that it has a completely flat spine. So many Japanese blades have a raised spine or a flat house-shaped spine, but this one's completely flat, which appears to have been more common in China. But I would like to see the antiques and see if their spine is raised and worn or if it's actually flat. Also, it's going to be hard to get in the camera, but the tip of this sword does not have a yokote or a grind line change, which is present on many Nihonto or Japanese blades. This one would be considered a Shoubilu because it's a shinogi blade without the yokote. It doesn't seem like having the kisaki with the yokote or the grind line was very popular in China. In addition to that, the guard here is a disc guard, and this one is based off a particular antique example. Now the original is made of copper alloy, but this one is made of iron, and it's pretty nice. It's more resilient than a copper one would be. Now moving on down to the grip. LK Chen based this grip wrap design off a surviving antique. However, I do think that this design choice might need to be reconsidered, because I'm all for modeling things off antiques, but I do have questions about, for one, how old is that original grip wrap? And for two, this grip wrap here is not nearly tight enough, and it hasn't been used for very long, and it already is loosened the ends, and with much use it will start to unravel. So it might be a good idea to reconsider how this grip wrap is done. I know that some depictions of these swords show a grip wrap that's more similar to what's done on Japanese blades. In the past, if an elite soldier has a problem with his grip wrap, it wouldn't be good. And he might be able to just have somebody redo it every time after every battle, but we modern consumers can't really afford that luxury, and I think that it might be a good idea to change the grip slightly. One other feature that distinguishes this blade from Japanese swords is the pommel. If we look at the pommel, it's a simple pommel cap, but notably it is pinned, where the tang goes all the way through and then is hammered down on the end of the pommel. This is something which was not really done on Japanese blades. Their handles were almost always secured through mikugi, or like a bamboo pin that goes through the handle and the tang. And many Chinese swords also had this, but in addition, they also pinned the handle. Both Jiguang and Zongyou also frequently refer to this sword as the Japanese Dao, and I think that should say something about its design and where this design originates. Jiguang even goes so far as to say that this design showed up in China whenever the Japanese pirates started terrorizing the coast. I don't think that's completely accurate, because we have earlier sources like the one I mentioned where we know that there's massive trade in these blades going back before that, the Wokou problem, and it's likely that some large two-handers got in before then. But for Jiguang and many of these other late Ming authors, it's very clear that this sword comes from Japan. But if we look at the martial arts and the techniques that are associated with this weapon, things get a lot more interesting, and the sources are a lot more complex. There are three main manuals for how to use the Changdao or the Dandao. One of them, as I mentioned before, is Jiguang. The other is Chen Changdao's Dandao Faxuan, and the last one is Wushu's Shoubilu. Now, I'm going to go through all these and kind of talk about what I see in them and the possible connections or lack of connection to Japanese arts that exists. Whenever Jiguang wrote his manual of techniques, he says that he procured a Japanese scroll and he read this scroll and then recreated some techniques from it. Now, the scroll is recorded in a couple period sources, and it is a Kageryu, or one of the Kageryu. We don't know exactly which one, and it describes 3 techniques. However, I'm not an expert on Japanese swordsmanship, and I'm not sure which Kageryus would be using a odachi that would also have like a large handle wrap like this and that kind of thing. And I do think that Jiguang likely read this text, this scroll, and then created a system based off of that. But once again, we have to ask ourselves, does that make this an explicit Japanese system? So there's also this thing of how does having this large blade collar impact how his martial art and the techniques work? It may be possible that having that extra length of handle means that he can incorporate some Dao techniques into his system, but that's extremely speculative. But I do think that whatever martial arts experience he previously had certainly influenced how he interpreted the Kage-ryu scroll. Now, the next text chronologically that comes, which discusses the use of the Dandao, is Chen Zongyou's Dandao Faxuan. And in this text, Chen Zongyou is much more comprehensive in his approach to this weapon. There's a lot of techniques in here. And what he says is that Chen Zongyou learned from a teacher, Liu Yunfeng, who in turn learned this directly from Japanese masters. So it is interesting that Chen Zongyou has a lineage which traces back to Japanese masters. However, things aren't so simple. So Chen Zongyou says that the postures and techniques he was given in this manual did not have names to them. So he just learned the physical movements. And it's possible that Liu Yunfeng was not able to speak Japanese when he's learning these techniques, so he just kind of learned the movements. Chen Zongyou not only created all the names for these techniques, but he also created an entire form. Chen Zongyou was a martial artist who very much believed in the efficacy of training forms, and he created a form for this weapon. So Chen Zongyou is imposing his own structure onto this weapon. In addition to that, there are specifically 4 techniques which he mentions are Japanese techniques. And because he explicitly mentions those are Japanese techniques, it raises questions about the other techniques and whether or not those ones are Japanese. In addition to that, I also think it's very important that we understand who Chen Zongyou was as a martial artist and how he viewed martial arts and weapons. First and foremost, Chen Zongyou was a master of the Shaolin staff, and a vast majority of his work is a Shaolin staff manual, which is extremely comprehensive and complex. He includes like 5 different forms and over 50 postures or techniques, as well as a whole large question and answers section. And he perceives the staff as a weapon which can be used to train almost all other weapons. And he explicitly makes some connections between the staff and the Japanese Dao. He says that many staff techniques can directly apply to the spear, they can apply to the Japanese sword, the Wodao, and they can even apply to unarmed fighting, depending on what they are. So he sees all these things as being connected, and he likes this idea of sharing techniques between systems. He also has a posture and the staff, the Dingxi, or the placing on the knee posture, which exists in both the Dandao and in the staff manual. So I think that it would be overly simplistic to label Chen Zongyou's system as a Japanese system. Conversely, I think it would be kind of ridiculous to say that he did not bring his own Shaolin staff experience into the Dandao, because his conception of martial arts is that the staff can be substitute for all these weapons. However, I think it's also important to take some of his claims about the Japanese origin of certain techniques seriously, and I don't think we can say that he's just making up claims about Japanese origins if we don't have good evidence for that. Now, the last manual which talks about the use of the Dandao is the Dandao Tushuo, written by Wushu, and it's a part of his larger manual, the Shoubilu, which is mostly concerned with spear techniques. Now, Wushu was someone who was born in the Ming dynasty, but died in the Qing dynasty, so he's kind of right in the middle of that transition between Ming to Qing. He writes that in his day, there were many masters of this Japanese sword in China. So it had already been quite widespread and existed in China at that point. Now, Wushu does not say explicitly who he learned the Dandao system from, but one of his famous spear teachers, Shi Jingyan, was also known to have been a co-student of Liu Yunfeng, who was Chen Zongyou's master. So Liu Yunfeng and Shi Jingyan both together studied the Japanese system, presumably from a Japanese master. This is only true if Wushu did indeed learn the Dandao from Shi Jingyan. It's possible he learned it from someone else because there were many masters in China at that time, right? Another important thing is that Wushu explicitly states that he also learned Jianfa, and some concepts of jianfa are influenced the way that he uses the Dandao. He particularly talks about making these cuts and sticking to the shaft of a weapon, and he says that this is something that he used from jianfa in his Dandao system. So with both Zongyou and Wushu, I think it's fairly clear to say that by the time they were learning and using these weapons, it was no longer really a Japanese martial art. I think that there was a big fusion of martial arts techniques going on from the beginning, where a pragmatic martial artist is going to use what they have from their own experience and take what they see from other systems. And I think that because of that, it's just very clear to me that these systems were not exactly Japanese martial arts. I highly doubt that if you went in the past and you studied Dandao, then you went over to Japan and you studied some Koryu, I don't think that they would be the same. I think that there's definitely evidence for indigenous Chinese martial arts being used in these systems. So now I want to take a look at many of the techniques that Chen Zongyou outlines in his manual, the Dandao Faxuan, and how you use the Dandao to po qiang, or break the spear, fight against the spear. And I didn't do all the postures because that's a lot, and also I don't have a good way to kind of mount the scabbard, so it's hard to practice a lot of the drawing techniques, but I did try to go through many of the techniques and outline how I think this system is supposed to work. So because Chen Zongyou provides two different sets of measurements for two different swords of this style, it's interesting to kind of look at the differences between using one or the other. Now, I don't have a smaller version of this at hand, but some of the techniques in his system requires you to use the blade with one hand, which is quite difficult with such a large weapon. In addition to that, he also shows that the postures are done with the crossbow, and the sword that you're supposed to use with the crossbow is a little shorter than this one. However, some of the drawing techniques are supposed to be done with an extra long sword. With this sword, I could just kind of barely draw it without having to grab the blade as he shows. But if I was a little shorter, then I would definitely have to grab the blade. And he also shows a technique where, two people kind of draw each other's swords to use them. And I think that it's quite clear that he intends his system to be used with either long weapons or short weapons, because it wouldn't make too much sense to have to draw a short blade in such an extreme manner. Doing these stances in the order that I think they're used, not necessarily in the order that they're in the text. So first we have these two pin the knee stances, and you basically take the base of the handle and you put it just above your knee, and you can move forward and backwards like this, and this is kind of a basic guard position. From here, you can then transition into either the lower watch stance or the on the bow, or like stringing the bow stance. And what this allows you to do is to take an oncoming spear and displace it to either side. So you can start and pin the knee and then drag the blade to either side, which will displace the spear. As you can see in these applications, the staff I'm using here is shorter than the big blade, but it's actually a similar size to the smaller sword that's in the Dandao Faxuan. Or insert stance is a way to counter a low line thrust from the lower watch posture. You knock the incoming thrust to the side and then you bash it aside whenever it starts to circle back around. Slanting slice stance is similar. It's a counter for low line thrust whenever you're in the on the bow stance. You knock the spear aside and then you go underneath with your own cut. Bury head stance is pretty straightforward. Basically, you present your head as a target and then you knock the spear to the side and come out with a big cut. And in some of these things, it's hard to actually reach the spearman, so what you can do is just slam the spear to the ground and then advance forward. Restrain the tiger stance is an optional entry into the enter the cave stance, which involves kind of grabbing the spear and then doing a couple one-handed cuts. Now, doing these one-handed cuts with this big sword is quite difficult, but I did practice and I managed to get a few cuts on tatami like this, so it's definitely doable, and it's a technique which is kind of hard to pull off in like a sparring situation, but if you do manage to grab the spear, doing these one-handed cuts is definitely an option. So both the right leg and left leg stand are a counter to a low line thrust at your leg, and you can use the back of the spine of the sword to knock the spear to the side and then come in with your cut. The outer watch posture is the one spin move that's in this manual. Basically, you displace the spear to your right side and then you spin around and in. And you can actually move quite quickly if you practice the footwork. Forward push posture is a way to recover if you miss the deflection for the spin move. Basically, you miss, they're stabbing, and then you come underneath and make a deflection to a cut. Crooked step stance is a way to make a good advancing deflection, and then you push against the spear so that it can't circle around as easy. Skyward stance is one of my favorites. You expose your back and then you swing the spine back to deflect, and then you turn this into a cut with this fluid motion. There's also a trick that you can do with the skyward stance where you secretly draw a knife where it's hidden from view, and then you throw this knife at the spearman and then come in with your attack. Now, if you practice this, you can actually throw the knife good. I can't do that, and whenever you're outside of the spear's range, you throw and then you rush in while they're recovering. Right side Liao stance is one of 4 techniques that Zongyou explicitly mentions come from Japan. Basically, you just make an upwards cut to knock the spear to the side and then come in with your own attack. And the left side is basically the same thing. I did find this technique was a little bit harder to pull off than the right side one, and I much prefer some of the earlier techniques. Next couple stances show a single-handed thrusting technique. You basically catch the spear with your left hand and then you take a side step and turn this into a single-handed thrust. This is a technique which would be very hard to pull off in combat, but would definitely work. Covering is shoulder the Dao stance. This is another Japanese technique that Chen Changdao used to bait the enemy in. You knock the spear to the side with your elbow, and then you come with a cut. This is a technique that would be pretty hard to pull off. Alright, so that's my extra long video about the LK Chen Yulin Chang Dao. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave some comments down below about any questions or critiques you might have. Thank you all for watching. Please subscribe and don't forget to stay sharp.